The gates of Buckingham Palace have never felt heavier than they do today. Not since the abdication crisis of 1936, when Edward VIII surrendered the crown for love and plunged the British monarchy into the most devastating constitutional emergency of the 20th century, has the institution stood at such a crossroads. That moment, the king who chose a woman over a throne, the brother who inherited the consequences, the nation that held its breath while history decided what came next has always been the reference point, the benchmark, the moment against which every subsequent royal crisis has been measured. But what is unfolding right now behind those imposing iron gates, inside those gilded corridors where history has a habit of happening in rooms the public never enters, makes that moment look like a rehearsal. King Charles III, the man who waited 7 decades for the crown, who buried his mother and stood in the rain at her funeral and carried the weight of an entire nation's grief on shoulders already bent by a lifetime of preparation, is preparing to do the unthinkable. He is stepping down. And not quietly, not with a whispered resignation delivered to a private secretary before breakfast, not with a carefully managed press release shaped by the palace's communications office to minimize disruption. King Charles is preparing to deliver a final address to the nation, a farewell to power, a speech that will formally declare the beginning of a new reign, the reign of King William V and Queen Catherine. But here is what the official palace statements will never tell you. The real story behind this abdication, the story of how it came to happen, what drove it, what shattered the last internal resistance to it, did not begin in a throne room or a constitutional meeting or a formal briefing from palace legal advisors. It began in a private meeting room, in a moment of extraordinary drama that the people present will carry with them for the rest of their lives, with a woman who stood up from her chair and did something that changed everything, not by stopping the abdication, by making it inevitable. The sound of her chair scraping across the stone floor, the silence that preceded it, the silence that followed it, these are the sounds at the center of this story. Because what Camilla said in the moments after she stood, and what she said later, in private, in the king's study, in the desperate calculation of a woman watching her entire world being reorganized without her consent, did not break Charles. It rebuilt him. It stripped away, in a single catastrophic act of misjudgment, the last threads of the emotional dependency that had defined their relationship for decades. And it sent him, that same night, down a corridor he had never walked before, to a door he knocked on for the first time with complete honesty, and a son who opened it and changed the course of the British monarchy. This is the story of how a king found his steel, how an abdication became the most significant act of service in a reign defined by service, how a threat meant to preserve power destroyed it, and how, in a lamplit study before dawn, the succession of the British monarchy happened not under a crown in a throne room, but between two men, a father and a son, finally reaching across a lifetime of complicated distance to do the thing that complicated distance had always prevented: trust each other completely. To understand why King Charles is abdicating, you first have to understand what wearing that crown actually cost him. Charles Philip Arthur George was not born to be a relaxed monarch. He was born to wait. For decades, through scandal and heartbreak and the loss of the most beloved princess the world had ever seen, he waited patient, disciplined, enduring, carrying with him the specific emotional weight of a man who has been shaped by his waiting more than by anything else in his life. When Queen Elizabeth II finally passed in September 2022, Charles was 73 years old. He was the oldest person in British history to ascend to the throne. Most men his age are settling into retirement, into gardens and grandchildren and the quieter rhythms of a life whose most demanding chapters are behind it. Charles was just getting started. His coronation at Westminster Abbey in May 2023 was magnificent gold pageantry, ancient ritual, the whole world watching. And for a brief, luminous moment, it seemed as though this complicated, misunderstood, deeply private man had finally arrived at the destiny that his entire life had been building toward. The crown was on his head. He was king. But destiny has a cruel sense of timing. Almost immediately after the coronation, the shadows began to gather. His health, long a subject of palace whispers, became impossible to ignore. The cancer diagnosis that arrived in early 2024 sent a chilling message through the institution with the specific force of something that everyone had been quietly dreading, and that arrived anyway on its own schedule, regardless of anyone's readiness. The king was mortal. The succession was no longer a distant theoretical concern that could be managed through long-term planning. It was urgent. It was present. It was sitting in the room every time his senior advisors met. And then there was the internal fracture, the fault line that had been quietly widening beneath the polished surface of royal life. Harry and Meghan continued to detonate bombshells from across the Atlantic. Andrew remained a permanent source of institutional shame, whose situation showed no signs of resolution. The press was relentless in the specific way it becomes relentless when it senses that the institution it is covering is under genuine structural pressure. The public mood was shifting in ways that polling captured only imperfectly, but William and Catherine were different. Through Catherine's own devastating cancer diagnosis and her extraordinary recovery, through the couple's carefully managed return to public duties, through William's increasingly confident and assured appearances on the world stage, something remarkable was happening. The British public was not simply tolerating the Prince and Princess of Wales. They were falling in love with them profoundly, genuinely, in a way that reminded older observers of a princess who had walked those same gilded halls 30 years before and who had understood something about the relationship between the monarchy and the people that the institution had spent decades struggling to recover. Charles saw it. Of course he saw it. He had spent his reign trying to hold the institution together, to modernize it without diminishing it, to make it relevant without making it ordinary. And he saw, with the specific clarity that illness sometimes grants to the things we have been avoiding looking at directly, that the work he had spent his life preparing to do was being done not by him, but by the people beside him. The question that must have kept him awake in those long nights at Sandringham, staring at the ceiling while the house creaked around him, was the same question that leaders of every kind eventually confront. At what point does your greatest act of service become the act of stepping aside? Nothing about what happened next was announced. Nothing was leaked to the press. No calendar invitations were sent through official channels. No briefing notes prepared for the palace communications team. And yet, inside the private meeting rooms of Buckingham Palace, a gathering took place that would alter the course of British royal history as completely as any coronation or any formal constitutional act. King Charles called it. He called it quietly, deliberately, with the full understanding of what he was about to declare and the full understanding of how it would land. The room itself communicates the weight of the moment to anyone who has sat in it. Crystal chandeliers casting golden light across polished wooden floors, royal portraits lining every wall, those permanent silent witnesses to centuries of triumph and catastrophe, who have watched every version of this family navigate, every version of this kind of crisis, and around the long table, the faces of the family Charles had spent his entire reign trying to hold together. Prince William arrived with the composed bearing of a man who already sensed, through whatever internal instrument develops in people who have grown up inside institutions and learned to read their atmospheres, the magnitude of what was coming. Beside him, Princess Catherine, still radiating that extraordinary calm elegance that had become her defining public quality, her hands folded in her lap, the very picture of the steadiness the British public had been drawing sustenance from across years of uncertainty. And then there was Camilla, Queen Consort, the woman who had spent decades navigating the most complicated public rehabilitation in the history of the modern monarchy and had arrived, through patience and composure and the specific kind of endurance that comes from having no alternative, at the position she now occupied. Charles rose to speak, and from the first sentence, the room understood that this was not a routine briefing, not an administrative update, not the kind of family meeting that palace life generates with its endless requirement for coordination and communication. His voice was low, steady, but laced with something they had never heard in it before. A finality, the kind of finality that cannot be walked back, that has been arrived at through a process too complete to be reversed by anything said in response to it. He spoke of time. He spoke of duty. He spoke of the invisible weight that health places on a sovereign who refuses to acknowledge his own limitations, and then he said it. He formally declared his intention to abdicate, to transfer the central power of the crown to Prince William and Princess Catherine, to place the future of the British monarchy, that ancient, battered, resilient institution, in the hands of the next generation. The room did not erupt. It did not gasp. It plunged into a silence so profound that the ticking of the ornate clock on the mantelpiece sounded like thunder. William's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Catherine's composure remained immaculate, but her eyes, those deeply perceptive eyes, betrayed the reality of the moment. This was real. This was happening. And then came the sound that shattered it all, the sharp scrape of a chair being dragged across the stone floor. Queen Camilla rose. The woman who rose from that chair was not the warm, gently self-deprecating Camilla that the public had gradually come to accept across years of carefully managed appearances and the slow, grudging work of public rehabilitation. This was a different version entirely. Her face could not fully conceal the tension coiling beneath its surface. Her eyes, which usually carried the studied warmth of someone who has learned that warmth is the most effective armor available to her, now burned with something sharper and more exposed, something defiant. She spoke with the measured authority of someone who had spent years learning exactly how to frame objection as wisdom. William, she argued, was still too young, still too inexperienced in the ancient customs and protocols that formed the genuine bedrock of the institution. The timing, she insisted, was catastrophically premature. The words sounded reasonable. They were designed to sound reasonable. They were the words of a concerned and experienced presence offering sober counsel to a king who was, in her framing, allowing the urgency of his health situation to cloud his judgment about what the institution actually required. But the room was not listening to the words. The room was watching her hands. The way her fingers tightened around the strap of her handbag, the barely perceptible tremor at the corner of her mouth, these were not the movements of a concerned stateswoman. The brutal truth that everyone around that table understood, whether or not they would ever speak it aloud, was this. Camilla's entire identity, her entire hard-won legitimacy, her very reason for being in that room at all was constructed around one axis. Her role as the power beside Charles, the woman who shaped his thinking, who had access to his most private self, whose influence ran through the institution's decision-making in ways that had no formal title and needed none because the informal version was more effective. Transfer that power to William, and what remained? Not nothing. She would retain the title, the residence, the ceremonial standing, but the substance of the position. The thing that had made the decades of public hostility worth enduring would be gone. She would be the consort of a former king, and she understood, in the specific way that people understand the things that matter most to them, that this was not survivable on the terms she had built her life around. Her interruption struck the room like a blade through silk. Charles stood frozen. You have to hold this moment in your imagination and understand what it contained for him. This was not a political opponent offering a challenging counter-argument. This was not a hostile journalist constructing a narrative he needed to rebut. This was the woman he had loved for most of his adult life. The woman for whom he had endured decades of public contempt, who had stood beside him through every storm and every scandal and every brutal headline and every moment of institutional siege. And she had just humiliated him publicly in front of his son, in front of his daughter-in-law, in front of the very people to whom he was attempting to pass the most sacred trust in British public life. His face shifted. Those who were present said it moved through crimson to a deathly pallor within seconds. A fracture was spreading through the room. You could feel it even if you couldn't see it. It was William who steadied the moment. He rose from his chair without drama, moved to his father's side, and with the measured tone of a man who was already, in every meaningful sense, operating from a position of authority, quietly announced that the meeting would adjourn so that everyone could reflect. It was graceful, it was decisive, and it sent a message that every person in that room received with complete clarity. The gathering broke apart quickly, but as Camilla's figure disappeared through the grand doors, Every person left behind understood one thing with absolute certainty. Nothing inside Buckingham Palace would ever be the same again. The door to the king's private study closed with a sound like a verdict being delivered. Inside, the familiar scent of sandalwood and old paper, the smell of Charles's entire adult life of preparation and patience now felt suffocating in a way it never had before. He stood with his back to the door, his shoulders carrying the particular tension of a man whose body has not yet found a language for the thing his mind has just understood. His hands, those hands marked by time, the hands that had shaken 1,000 diplomatic hands and signed 1,000 official documents, gripped the edge of the oak desk until the knuckles went white. Camilla had followed him. She stood in the center of the room with her chin lifted in the manner she had cultivated over decades, the posture of a woman accustomed to being heard and, eventually, obeyed. But her eyes told a different story. Behind the performance of confidence was something she had not often needed to perform: real fear. The kind that arrives when a person realizes they have pushed things past the point of retrieval and that no available move can restore the position that has just been lost. She spoke. And what she said in that room, according to those who have since been told of it in confidence, represents perhaps the single most consequential act of misjudgment in the modern history of the British royal family. She reached back past the crown, past the palace, past the decades of shared life and shared understanding, and the intimate architecture of a relationship that had been built in the specific conditions of mutual need and mutual protection. She reached into the darkest corners of Charles's most guarded personal history. She invoked the memories he had spent a lifetime trying to bury, Gordonstown boarding school. The place Charles had once described, in the unguarded language of genuine pain, as a kind of private hell, the loneliness, the bullying, the profound unhappiness of a sensitive boy thrown into a brutally harsh environment with no emotional rescue in sight. He had trusted her with these things. In the small hours of their most intimate moments, he had whispered to her the parts of himself he had shown to no one else. And now, in the desperation of this moment, she made clear through implication and calculated suggestion that those secrets need not remain private. It was a threat, breathtaking, catastrophic, irreversible, and it did not break Charles. It rebuilt him. He turned around slowly, and the eyes that met hers were not the eyes of the man she thought she knew. The vulnerability that had defined him across a lifetime, the endless search for approval, the ancient need for comfort and validation, the emotional openness that had always been both his greatest gift and his most exploited quality was gone. In its place was something harder, something final. He understood, perhaps in that very instant, with the specific clarity that arrives when something you have been half knowing for a very long time finally becomes completely known, that the woman standing in front of him had not been the refuge he had believed. She had been, in her own way, a kind of captor, and the cage door had just swung open. He stepped to his desk. He picked up his fountain pen. He began to write. He did not speak to her. He did not acknowledge her presence. He wrote with the focused attention of someone who has found his direction and is moving in it. Camilla stood in that room and watched the man she thought she controlled become, for the first time in both their lives, genuinely unreachable. The study had not changed: the same desk, the same portraits, the same clock ticking on the mantelpiece. But the balance of power in it had shifted so completely that they might as well have been standing in entirely different buildings. She had walked in intending to break him. She had instead broken something between them that no act of contrition, no gesture of reconciliation, no passage of time would ever be able to repair. Later that same night, long after the palace had settled into its official silence and the corridors had emptied of everything except the staff who maintain the building's continuous functions, regardless of what is happening within its private rooms, King Charles walked toward a different part of the palace with a different step. The hesitation that had always been part of his bearing, that slight tentativeness, the physical remnant of a lifetime of second-guessing, of seeking permission before proceeding, was absent. His leather soles struck the stone floor with a purpose that the palace walls had not heard from him before. He was walking toward the private study of the Prince of Wales, When William opened the door, no elaborate greeting passed between them. No diplomatic preamble, no careful framing, none of the protective layering that royal family members typically apply to conversations that touch the most sensitive territory of their relationships. The kind of conversation that was about to happen does not require any of that. Charles sat down and he told his son everything, every detail of what Camilla had said in the study, every threatening implication, every weaponized memory she had reached for in the desperate calculation of a woman trying to pull a man back from a decision she could not survive. He said it plainly, without embellishment, without the protective varnish that royals typically apply to family dysfunction. He was not performing strength. He was exercising it for the first time in the one relationship where it had always cost him the most. William listened with the stillness of a man exercising extraordinary self-control. His face revealed nothing unnecessary, but his hands gripping the arms of his chair betrayed the quiet fire burning below the surface. In his father, in that moment, William saw two things simultaneously. He saw the king, the sovereign, who had just been subjected to a betrayal of trust so intimate and so complete that it required a specific kind of courage even to describe it. And he saw the father, the complicated, flawed, deeply human man who had always struggled to close the emotional distance between them, who had wanted to be closer and had not known how, and who was now, in the most unlikely of circumstances and at the most improbable hour, reaching across that distance completely and without reservation. What passed between them in that dimly lit study was not merely a political alliance. It was something more ancient and more powerful than that. It was the transfer of genuine trust between two men who shared blood and burden across a generation of misunderstanding and missed connection. It was the moment the distance closed. William was not simply supportive, he was immediately strategic. He began mapping the next steps, the seating arrangement for the follow-up meeting, the framing of the abdication announcement, the management of the family's unified response. The sharp, decisive mind that had been quietly developing behind his careful public image for years was now fully visible, operating with a precision and a confidence that required no external direction. This was not a man waiting to be told what to do. This was a man already doing it. When Charles finally rose and placed his hand on William's shoulder, a gesture so rare in their world of rigid ceremonial distance that it carried the weight of an oath, something irreversible had been completed. The succession of the British monarchy had already happened, not in a throne room, not under a crown, not witnessed by the public or recorded by the cameras or announced through any official channel. In a lamplit study, in the quiet hours before dawn, between a king stepping back and a king stepping forward, the thing had been done. The second meeting was nothing like the first. Where the first had been unexpected and emotionally raw, blindsided by Camilla's intervention and fractured by the force of what she had said, this one was surgical. Every element had been considered in advance. The seating arrangement was deliberate. The documentation prepared on the table was deliberate. The specific individuals invited were deliberate. And the position in which Camilla would find herself present but unmistakably repositioned, the geometry of the room communicating what no verbal statement had yet been required to say, was the most deliberate element of all. She arrived wearing an emerald velvet ensemble, the effort of presentation clearly intentional, the armor of a woman who understood that optics were now her only remaining instrument. But the moment she entered the room and processed what she was seeing, the color drained from behind her carefully composed expression. William and Catherine were positioned closer to the king than ever before. The physical arrangement of their presence around the table, communicating a gravitational shift that the room's geometry made impossible to misread. She swept the space for allies. She found none. The faces that had once returned her knowing glances and offered the quiet solidarity of people who understood which way the power ran, now returned only careful neutrality. The winds had changed direction overnight. Everyone in the room had noticed. No one was going to be caught leaning into the old wind. Charles rose to speak, and the difference from the previous meeting was immediate and total. His voice carried no tremor of personal emotion. It rang out with the clarity and finality of a decision that had already been made, documented, and was now simply being announced for the record. He restated the abdication. He laid out the roadmap with specific, irreversible detail. He did not look toward Camilla once, not once. That deliberate avoidance, the complete absence of the instinct to seek her reaction that had defined decades of his behavior in rooms where she was present, was itself the loudest statement in the room. Something that had always been true of him, something that everyone who had watched them together for years had noticed and understood as a form of emotional dependency, was simply gone. Camilla tried to signal her opposition through body language, a slight shake of the head, a calculated sigh, timed to interrupt the rhythm of Charles's words. Then her eyes met William's, and she stopped. What she saw in that gaze was not the look of a threatened son waiting to be challenged. It was the look of a sovereign, observing a political error being made in slow motion, watching it with the specific patience of someone who knows that the error will resolve itself and that intervention is neither necessary nor appropriate. William sat perfectly still, hands flat on the table. His presence radiated a quiet and overwhelming authority that required no words and no gestures. Beside him, Catherine's expression was equally resolute. The two of them together formed something Camilla had simply not anticipated, an impenetrable wall of unified generational purpose that rendered her resistance not merely ineffective but faintly absurd. The other family members began to signal their agreement one by one. Gentle nods, firm but undemonstrative. No one rose to defend the Queen's position. The official document was placed on the table. William stood and accepted it from his father with the absolute respect of a man who understood the full weight of what was being transferred. Catherine offered a quiet smile, not triumphant, never triumphant, but the smile of a woman who understood the full gravity of the responsibility she was now accepting. Camilla did not move. She sat with her eyes fixed on the fading afternoon light on the opposite wall. The ship had sailed. The era she had spent her life navigating toward had closed behind her like a door pulled shut by someone else's hand. Word of the abdication reached the public in the way that the most seismic royal news always does, through a leak so carefully managed that it functions more like a planned announcement than an accident, arriving in the media ecosystem at precisely the moment that allows the institution to follow it immediately with the formal communication it was always going to make. The palace scheduled a national address. King Charles would speak directly to the people, a final speech, the last act of a reign defined by its patience, its complexity, and its extraordinary moment of self-sacrifice at the very end. The morning of the address, Buckingham Palace had a different quality to its silence. Staff moved through the corridors with the heightened awareness of people who understand they are living inside a historic moment, the specific kind of heightened attention that produces an unusual quietness rather than an unusual noise, as though the building itself is concentrating. William and Catherine were present. Their 3 children, George and Charlotte and Louis, were somewhere within those same walls, the next generation of a dynasty that would carry this name forward for decades to come, perhaps centuries. Children who would one day understand the full significance of the morning they spent inside the palace on the day their grandfather gave up the crown. Charles dressed with particular care that morning. Not in the full regalia of state, not in the military splendor of ceremonial occasions, not in the visual language of power being performed. He chose something quieter, more personal, the understated presentation of a man who is not performing power but surrendering it, and doing so with the grace that comes from having genuinely decided rather than from having been forced. He stood at the podium and he looked out at the cameras and the press and the faces of the people who had watched him for his entire life, and he began to speak. He spoke of his mother, of the standard she had set, the standard no monarch could reasonably expect to exceed, but that every subsequent monarch was obligated to understand and to honor. He spoke of service, not as an abstraction or a ceremonial concept, but as the lived, daily, relentless practice of placing duty above every personal desire, every personal wound, every personal preference, the practice she had demonstrated for 70 years and that he had tried, in his own complicated and human way, to sustain. He spoke of William and Catherine with a warmth that surprised even those closest to him, the sharpness of William's mind, the depth of his empathy, the iron in his resolve. Catherine's extraordinary capacity for connection, her unshakable steadiness, her gift for making the institution feel human without making it feel diminished. He said that the decision he was announcing was not a retreat. It was, he believed, the greatest act of service he could offer to step aside at the moment of his own choosing, while still able to witness the succession clearly and ensure its foundation was solid. He did not mention Camilla. Her name did not appear once in the speech. And in that silence, in that single deliberate omission that every journalist and every royal observer would notice, and that the palace communications team had chosen to leave precisely as it was, the British public understood everything they needed to understand about what had occurred behind those palace walls in the days before this address was delivered. He ended not with ceremony, but with something close to poetry. He looked directly into the camera, past the lens, past every apparatus of mediation between himself and the people he was addressing, and said that the crown's greatest strength had never been the person wearing it. It had always been the people standing beneath it. And then King Charles III stepped back from the podium. Charles retreated to Highgrove in the days that followed with something that the people who know him best described as visible relief, not happiness, exactly. Not the uncomplicated lightness of someone whose burdens have simply been lifted, but the specific quality of relief that belongs to someone who has made a difficult decision and is living on the right side of it. He walked his gardens, he tended his organic plots, he wrote and read and slept with a consistency that had eluded him for years. The man who had spent 7 decades waiting to become king had worn the crown for less than 3 years. And yet the early assessment of his reign, the early draft of what history would eventually write about it, seemed to converge on a judgment that none of his advisors had predicted and that the public itself had perhaps not fully formed until the moment of the speech. His most significant act as monarch had been this: recognizing the moment when stepping forward meant stepping aside. Camilla remained at Ray Mill House in Wiltshire. The separation between her and Charles, never officially confirmed, never publicly denied, never addressed directly by any palace spokesperson, became simply a fact of life that the institution's formidable communications operation managed through the specific technique of neither acknowledging nor denying, which in palace terms is as close to a formal statement as some situations require. She attended select ceremonial events. She performed select charitable obligations. She did so with the practiced composure of a woman who has survived worse and who understands that composure maintained consistently is itself a form of narrative. But the rooms she moved through were emptier than they used to be, the conversations more formal. The warmth that had once defined her relationship with the institution had quietly and definitively cooled in ways that no formal announcement had needed to describe. William and Catherine stepped into the full light of their new role with a confidence that seemed to have been stored up and waiting, the specific confidence of people who have been preparing for something for a very long time, who, when it finally arrives, find that the preparation was adequate. Their public engagements carried a different charge. The crowds that gathered were responding not merely to symbols of the crown, but to specific, knowable, deeply human people who were carrying the weight of an ancient institution on their shoulders, and doing so with apparent steadiness and apparent willingness, the two qualities that the public most needed to see and that the preceding years had taught them not to take for granted. The monarchy William and Catherine inherit is not the monarchy that Charles received from his mother. It is smaller, in a sense, more transparent, more exposed to the scrutiny that digital information environments apply, with a relentlessness that no previous era of royal life had needed to navigate. The margin for error is narrower than it has ever been. The public's tolerance for the gap between royal presentation and royal reality has never been thinner. William knows this. You can see it in the way he operates that combination of his mother's warmth and something distinctly and specifically his own, a strategic clarity that neither parent possessed in quite the same measure, the intelligence of someone who grew up inside the institution and studied it with the attention of a person who understood they would one day be responsible for it. Catherine knows it too. She has faced the most personal of crucibles, illness, recovery, the restructuring of her own public identity under a pressure so intense and so unrelenting that most people, in most circumstances, would have broken under it. She did not break. She emerged from it with an authority that no title could have conferred, that no coronation ceremony could manufacture, that can only be produced by the specific process of going through something genuinely terrible and coming out the other side intact. It was earned. Deeply, personally, irrevocably earned. The question that lingers over everything, the question that the events of these days cannot quite resolve, is the one about Camilla. Was her decision to reach into Charles's most private wounds and use them as leverage the defining mistake of her royal story? The single act of overreach that cost her everything she had spent decades building? Or was it, as some have quietly suggested, simply the moment when a truth that had always been present finally became impossible to conceal? Because ambition at the level Camilla operated never hides easily. It adapts, it manages, it presents itself as wisdom, as reasonable concern, as the cautious counsel of experience. And sometimes, in a moment of genuine threat, when the thing it has been protecting is suddenly and completely at risk, the mask slips. And what you see underneath is the thing that was always there, the engine beneath the composure, the calculation beneath the warmth, the woman who understood from the beginning that in the game of royal power, sentiment is just another tool. Charles gave up the crown, but before he did, he gave up something harder. He gave up the belief that even complicated, hard-won, fiercely defended love that survived decades of public hatred, that endured years of institutional siege, that was defended at costs that would have made most people abandon it long before, is enough to survive when the fundamental nature of a relationship has been fully and finally revealed. He found his steel in the worst possible way. He found it because someone he loved handed it to him in a moment of desperation and did not understand what she was giving him. And the monarchy, ancient and battered and resilient, moves forward into the reign of King William V, carrying the specific knowledge that its survival in the 21st century will depend not on the protection of bloodlines or the management of private arrangements, but on something considerably simpler and considerably harder to sustain: the willingness to be honest, even when honesty costs everything.